1917, Britain was broke. Not strained, not struggling, broke. Its overdraft at J.P. Morgan had reached nearly $400 million. The American Federal Reserve had warned that further loans might not be possible. The financial architecture keeping Britain in the war was collapsing. And in that moment, a British cabinet minister made a decision that had nothing to do with the battlefield. He promised land Britain did not own in Palestine over the heads of 700,000 people already living there. And the man he made that promise to was not a politician. He was a banker. The promise was just 67 words long, but those 67 words set in motion one of the most consequential conflicts in modern history, a conflict that has never been resolved and still shapes global politics today. The standard story says Britain acted out of strategy and sympathy and idealism, and that is partially true, but beneath that story is something colder, more transactional, because when you follow the money, what you find is not a moral decision. The Balfour Declaration was a financial deal. A bankrupt empire trading promises for survival, and the banking network behind that deal connected Britain's largest creditor to the man receiving the letter in ways that have never been fully examined together, until now. To understand why Britain made this deal, you have to understand how desperate Britain actually was by 1917. Go back to the summer of 1914. Europe had just stumbled into the most catastrophic war it had ever seen, and Britain entered it with a confidence that in hindsight reads almost as delusion. The British Empire was the largest empire in human history. Its navy ruled every ocean on Earth. Its currency, the pound sterling, was the foundation of global finance, and its political class genuinely believed the whole thing would be over by Christmas. It was not over by Christmas. It was not over by the next Christmas, or the one after that. What Britain discovered to its mounting horror was that modern industrial warfare was not like anything that had come before. This was not a war of cavalry charges and quick, decisive battles. This was an unending machine of industrial death, and that machine required an equally unending machine of money to keep it running. Every single day, the British government was spending sums of money that would have been unimaginable in peacetime. The bills for shells, for guns, for ships, for food, for uniforms, for men, they kept arriving and they never stopped. Here is a number that puts everything that follows into context. In 1914, the British national debt stood at around £650 million. By 1919, when the smoke had finally cleared, it stood at £7.7 billion. That is not a rounding error. That is a more than tenfold increase in 5 years. Britain had gone from being the world's largest creditor nation to a desperate debtor nation scrambling to keep its head above water. The city of London, once the undisputed financial capital of the earth, was quietly surrendering that title to New York. Everyone in power knew it. Nobody wanted to say it out loud. And the most pressing creditor of all was not a government. It was a bank. J.P. Morgan and Company of New York. From the very first days of the war, J.P. Morgan had become Britain's primary financial agent in the United States. Every shell Britain purchased from American manufacturers, every ton of grain, every uniform, every weapon, all of it passed through J.P. Morgan's accounts. By the spring of 1917, Britain's overdraft at J.P. Morgan had reached nearly $400 million. That single overdraft represented more than half of Britain's entire pre-war national debt. Britain was not simply borrowing from J.P. Morgan. Britain was dependent on J.P. Morgan. There is a difference. When you are borrowing, you have options. When you're dependent, you have none. And then in early 1917, something happened that sent genuine panic through the British War Cabinet. American President Woodrow Wilson instructed the Federal Reserve to discourage American banks from making further loans to Britain and France. Not to stop them, just to discourage them. That single word, discourage, was enough. Almost overnight, the private financing structure that had been keeping the Allied war effort alive began to lurch toward the edge of collapse. Wilson was not doing this out of hostility. He was doing it because he wanted leverage. He wanted the Allies to understand that American money would keep flowing, but it would flow on American terms. At the precise moment Britain was most financially vulnerable, its most important source of credit had just made its support conditional. Britain needed new allies, new sources of money, new sources of political support, and it needed them immediately. But here is the detail that most accounts of the Balfour Declaration leave out entirely. J.P. Morgan and the Rothschild banking family had been doing business together for decades. They shared clients. They shared deals. They moved in the same financial circles. They trusted each other. The Rothschilds were not simply a Jewish banking family with an interest in Palestine. They were embedded at the very center of the same financial network that was keeping Britain alive. And it was to Lord Walter Rothschild, the head of the British branch of that family, that the Balfour Declaration would be personally addressed, not to Chaim Weizmann, the Zionist leader who had spent years negotiating the declaration, not to the Zionist Federation, the official organization representing the movement, to a Rothschild. Balfour chose that name deliberately, because that name carried something that no political title could match. It carried financial weight. It carried a signal to every Jewish investor, every Jewish community, every Jewish financial institution watching from New York to Petrograd that Britain was serious, that this was not just a political promise, that this was a transaction between empires. And the desperation behind that transaction was about to get worse. Because at the exact same moment Britain was running out of money, it was also running out of something even more immediately dangerous. Something without which the entire British war effort would grind to a halt within months. Not gold, not credit, not men, a chemical. The chemical was called acetone. Most people have never heard of it. But in 1916, acetone was arguably the most strategically important substance on Earth. Acetone was the essential solvent used in the production of cordite. Cordite was the smokeless explosive propellant loaded into virtually every shell fired by British forces on the Western Front. Without acetone, you cannot make cordite. Without cordite, your artillery goes silent. And in the industrial slaughter of the Western Front, artillery was not just a weapon. It was the weapon, the thing that determined hour by hour who lived and who died. Before the war, Britain had imported most of its acetone from Germany and other Central European sources. Those sources were now completely closed, and Britain's acetone supplies were running out. Not slowly. Not gradually. Running out at the precise moment the war's appetite for shells had become truly insatiable. By 1916, the British military was firing shells at a rate that would have been inconceivable even 2 years earlier. And the factories producing those shells were beginning to slow down. Not because of manpower. Not because of steel. Because of a chemical that most people in Britain had never heard of. The British government was staring at a crisis that most history books do not discuss alongside Gallipoli or the Somme. But it was arguably just as dangerous. Without acetone, the guns would fall silent. And if the guns fell silent on the Western Front, the war was lost. Now picture this man. He is 42 years old in 1916. He was born in a small Jewish village in the Russian Empire, a place called Motol, in what is now Belarus. He grew up speaking Yiddish at home and Russian in the street. He watched his community live under the constant shadow of persecution, the specific fear that had followed Jewish communities across Eastern Europe for centuries. He studied chemistry first in Germany, then in Switzerland, then in England, where he eventually settled. He became a naturalized British citizen. He built a career as a biochemist at the University of Manchester, and for as long as anyone who knew him could remember, he carried one dream: not wealth, not fame, not academic recognition, a homeland, a place where Jewish people could live without the fear he had grown up with, a place in Palestine. His name was Chaim Weizmann. And in 1916, sitting in his Manchester laboratory, he held something that the most powerful empire on Earth desperately needed. Weizmann had spent years developing a fermentation process, a biological method of converting cereal starches into acetone, from grain, from maize, and at one extraordinary moment when grain supplies ran critically short, from horse chestnuts. Ordinary horse chestnuts collected by British schoolchildren who had been sent out across the countryside filling sacks with fallen chestnuts from parks and roadsides, not knowing exactly why, just knowing that the government needed them. Children filling sacks with horse chestnuts to keep the artillery firing on the Western Front. That is the specific texture of what total war looks like when you pull back the curtain. When Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, learned of Weizmann's process, he summoned him immediately. Churchill looked at Weizmann across the desk and asked him directly, "Can you make 30,000 tons of acetone?" Weizmann answered that once the bacteriology of the process was established, it was only a question of scale. Churchill did not hesitate. Distillery equipment was commandeered across Britain. Dedicated factories were built. The Royal Naval Cordite Factory at Holton Heath in Dorset was converted to run the Weizmann fermentation process at industrial scale. By 1917, Weizmann's process was producing nearly 3,000 tons of acetone per year. Between 1914 and 1918, the British Army and Navy fired 248 million shells. A Russian Jewish biochemist from a village most British soldiers had never heard of had kept the guns of the British Empire firing. Now there is a story that gets repeated in almost every account of the Balfour Declaration. The story goes that when Balfour later asked Weizmann what he wished in return for his contribution to the war, Weizmann looked at him and said simply, "There is only one thing I want, a national home for my people." Weizmann himself was skeptical of this story. He wrote later that he almost wished it had been as simple as that. But that history does not deal in Aladdin's lamps, and he was right. The reality was not a single dramatic exchange. The reality was something more patient, more calculated, and in many ways more remarkable. What the acetone process gave Weizmann was not a direct transaction. It gave him something more valuable than any transaction. It gave him access. It gave him credibility. It gave him the specific trust that only comes from having delivered something real when the stakes were highest. He met with Balfour privately, not once but multiple times. He had the ear of Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of the British Empire. He knew Herbert Samuel, who would later become the first British High Commissioner of Palestine. In the corridors of Whitehall, Weizmann was no longer simply a Zionist asking for a favor. He was a man who had solved a problem that nobody else could solve. And he used that position with extraordinary patience and skill. He told the British government that the vast majority of Jews worldwide were Zionists and would flood to Britain's side if Britain publicly embraced their cause. He told them that Jewish financial influence in the United States was enormous, and that a British pro-Zionist declaration could mobilize American Jewish support for greater American commitment to the war. And then in a move of remarkable diplomatic intelligence, he warned the British that Germany was considering making its own pro-Zionist declaration, that if Germany moved first, Jewish sympathies across the world could swing away from the Allies entirely. That last argument landed like a hammer inside the British War Cabinet. The fear of being outmaneuvered, of losing a propaganda advantage to the enemy, was a powerful thing to place in the minds of men who were already drowning. But here's what those men in the War Cabinet did not fully appreciate. Weizmann's assessment of Jewish political unity was significantly overstated. Russian Jews were deeply divided on the Zionist question. The majority of politically active Russian Jews were socialists, not Zionists. Jewish financial influence in America, while real, was nowhere near as unified or as decisive as Weizmann had suggested. And the German pro-Zionist declaration that Weizmann had warned about so urgently? It never came. What Weizmann had done with a skill that deserves genuine acknowledgement, regardless of where you stand on anything that followed, was take a desperate empire's most urgent needs and position himself and his cause as the answer to all of them simultaneously. He had solved the acetone crisis. He had offered a propaganda solution to the American problem. He had offered a counter to the Russian collapse. He had made the Zionist cause look like the answer to questions Britain was already asking. The acetone deal was never written down as a formal transaction. There was no signed agreement. No document that said your chemistry in exchange for a promise. But the access it created, the credibility it built, the trust it established in the highest offices of the most powerful government on earth. That was the bridge. And on the other side of that bridge was a letter, 67 words long, addressed not to Weizmann, but to a banker. Before we talk about the promises Britain made, we need to talk about the land those promises were made about. Because the Balfour Declaration did not describe an empty territory waiting to be filled, it described a place where people already lived. And understanding who those people were and how they were treated in the negotiations that determined their future is not a political statement. It is a documented historical fact. In 1917, the land at the center of this story was a province of the Ottoman Empire. It had been under Ottoman rule for 4 centuries, and it was home to approximately 700,000 people. The overwhelming majority were Arab Muslims and Arab Christians, farmers, merchants, craftsmen, teachers, families, communities that had lived on that land for generations, that had built towns and villages and olive groves and markets, that had their own culture, their own traditions, their own understanding of who they were and where they belonged. Jewish communities also existed in the region. Ancient communities centered primarily in Jerusalem, Hebron, Tiberias, and Safed, with deep roots going back centuries. But in terms of raw numbers, Jews made up fewer than 10% of the total population. Some estimates place the Jewish population at the time of the Balfour Declaration at around 60,000 people compared to more than 700,000 Arabs. This is not a minor detail. It is the central demographic fact of the situation. And it is the fact that the Balfour Declaration's authors chose to address with a single subordinate clause buried at the end of the letter. The existing majority population of 700,000 people was described in the document that would determine their fate, not by name, not as a people, not as a community with political rights or national aspirations, but simply as a consideration to be kept in mind. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. Civil and religious rights, not political rights, not national rights, not the right to determine their own future, the right to pray, the right to go to church or mosque. That was the extent of the guarantee offered to the 700,000 people whose homeland was being promised to someone else. Arthur Balfour himself, in a private memorandum written in 1919, was blunter than the letter. He wrote that they did not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country. He used the word form, not the substance of consultation, not genuine engagement, not even the appearance of it. Zionism, he wrote, was of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who then inhabited that ancient land. Balfour wrote that in his own hand in a private document not intended for public consumption. Now, why does this matter to the financial history we are telling? Because the people of that land were not simply absent from the negotiations, they were structurally excluded from them. In the same way that Ottoman citizens had no seat at the table when European banking houses designed the financial architecture that would extract their wealth, the Arab population had no seat at the table when Britain designed the political architecture that would determine their future. The mechanism was identical. a powerful external institution making decisions about a territory and its people without the knowledge or consent of those most affected. The Ottoman debt crisis transferred wealth from ordinary people to distant creditors. The Balfour Declaration transferred sovereignty over land from its existing inhabitants to a distant promise. Both were transactions. Both were conducted over the heads of the people who would bear the consequences. And in both cases, the people at the table were not the people who would pay the price. There was one more voice that needs to be heard here, and it came from inside the British cabinet itself. Edwin Montagu was the Secretary of State for India in 1917. He was also the only Jewish member of the British cabinet, and he was deeply passionately opposed to the Balfour Declaration. He wrote a cabinet memorandum that was remarkable in its clarity. He argued that the declaration was, in his exact words, anti-Semitic in its result. His argument was precise. If Britain defined Jewish people as a nation without a country and proposed to relocate them to Palestine, it would give ammunition to those who wanted to strip Jewish citizens of their rights in every country where they lived. It would suggest to every anti-Semite in Europe and beyond that Jewish people's true loyalty lay not with the countries where they were born and raised and educated and working, but with a distant territory they had never seen. Montagu was not arguing against the Jewish people. He was arguing for them. He was saying that the declaration would make the situation of Jewish communities across the world more dangerous, not less. His objections were overruled. And there is one more dimension to Montagu's warning that history has since validated. He argued that Britain was making a promise it could not keep, that the declaration contained within it an irresolvable contradiction. You cannot simultaneously promise a national home to one people and guarantee the civil rights of another people already living in the same territory without those two promises coming into direct conflict. They were not compatible. They had never been compatible. And the men writing the declaration knew they were not compatible. They proceeded anyway, because a bankrupt empire at war does not have the luxury of resolving contradictions before it makes promises. It makes the promises first and leaves the contradictions for someone else to resolve later. That is the documented record of who was living in that land in 1917 and how they were treated in the transaction that determined their fate. Not with hostility, not with deliberate malice, but with something in some ways worse. With indifference. With the specific indifference of powerful men making calculations about land and people and promises in rooms where those people had no voice and no seat. By the time Arthur Balfour sat down to write that letter in November of 1917, Britain had already made two other major promises about the future of that same land. Two promises that directly contradicted what Balfour was about to write, and both of those promises were still technically in force. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented in British government archives. Britain issued 3 separate obligations against the same piece of land to 3 different parties within a 2-year window without the knowledge of the others. If you have been following this channel's coverage of the Ottoman debt crisis, you will recognize this structure immediately. It is the same mechanism, multiple obligations issued against the same collateral, each one presented as legitimate, each one impossible to honor simultaneously. The Ottoman Empire issued bonds it could never repay. Britain issued promises it could never keep. The instrument was different. The architecture was identical. The first promise was made in a series of letters exchanged between 1915 and 1916. On one side, Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Egypt. On the other side, Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, the man who controlled the 2 holiest cities in Islam. Britain needed Hussein to launch a military revolt against the Ottoman Empire, to open a new front, to stretch Ottoman forces thin, to give Britain's forces in the Middle East a fighting chance. Hussein agreed. But not for nothing. In exchange for launching what would become known as the Great Arab Revolt, Hussein wanted a guarantee. A promise that the Arab lands of the former Ottoman Empire would become an independent Arab state after the war. McMahon gave that guarantee, not in the vague language of diplomatic courtesy, but in letters, specific letters, that are preserved in the British National Archives to this day. The exact boundaries were deliberately kept vague, a piece of diplomatic ambiguity that would generate argument for a century. But internal British documents, including a note from Lord Curzon in 1918 and a memorandum from the Foreign Office's Political Intelligence Department in 1919, stated plainly that the land at the center of this story had been included within the scope of the promise of Arab independence. Britain had promised it to the Arabs, in exchange for their blood and their military contribution to the war. The second promise was made in May of 1916, in a secret agreement. So secret that it was not made public until the Bolsheviks found it in the Russian Imperial Archives after the revolution and published it specifically to embarrass Britain and France. The agreement was named after its 2 chief architects, Sir Mark Sykes of Britain and François-Georges Picot of France. The Sykes-Picot agreement carved up the entire Middle East between British and French spheres of influence in anticipation of the Ottoman Empire's collapse. Under Sykes-Picot, the land at the center of this story was designated for international administration. Not British control, not French control, international administration. It was not to be handed to any particular ethnic or religious group. It was not to be promised to anyone. It was to be governed collectively by the great powers. Britain had already agreed to this, in writing, with France, before Balfour wrote his letter. And then came November 1917, and the letter to Lord Rothschild, 67 words promising a national home for the Jewish people. So let us be precise about where things stood on the 2nd of November 1917 when Arthur Balfour signed that letter. Britain had promised the land to the Arabs in exchange for the Arab Revolt. Britain had agreed with France to place it under international administration in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and now Britain was promising the Zionist movement a Jewish national home in the same territory. 3 promises, 3 completely different destinations for the same piece of land, all made by the same empire, within a 2-year window, each without the knowledge of the others. When the Bolsheviks published the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement in late November of 1917, just weeks after the Balfour Declaration, Arab leaders were outraged. Hussein felt personally betrayed. The elaborate architecture of British promises was suddenly visible to everyone at the same time, and it was, to put it as generously as possible, self-contradictory. Lord Curzon, one of the most senior figures in the British government, later privately confirmed that the McMahon-Hussein correspondence had promised the land as Arab and independent. A Foreign Office note in 1923 privately acknowledged that Britain had committed itself to incompatible pledges and that the best policy was to let sleeping dogs lie. Let sleeping dogs lie. That was the official British position on 3 contradictory promises made to 3 different parties about the same land. Not resolution, not honesty, not acknowledgement. Let sleeping dogs lie. T.E. Lawrence, the man known as Lawrence of Arabia, who had personally helped orchestrate the Arab Revolt on Britain's behalf, who had ridden with Arab fighters who had made promises in Britain's name to men who trusted him, wrote later that he had spent years being continually and bitterly ashamed. Those are not the words of a man describing a policy disagreement. Those are the words of a man describing a betrayal. Now here is the financial framing that most accounts of this story miss entirely. In the Ottoman debt crisis, European banking houses issued bonds against Ottoman revenues, knowing that the obligations could never all be honored simultaneously. The structure was designed to generate leverage, not to generate repayment. Britain did something structurally identical with its promises. It issued 3 obligations against the same asset, knowing or at minimum strongly suspecting that they could not all be honored simultaneously. The asset was not a revenue stream, it was a territory. And the people living in that territory were the ones who would ultimately pay when the obligations came due, and Britain discovered it could not honor all 3 at once. The record of the British War Cabinet meeting on the 31st of October 1917, just 2 days before Balfour sent the letter, is remarkably candid about what was actually being decided. Balfour told his colleagues that the vast majority of Jews in Russia and America appeared to be favorable to Zionism, and that if Britain could make a declaration favorable to such an ideal, they would be able to carry on extremely useful propaganda both in Russia and America. Extremely useful propaganda. That is the language of the document. Not humanitarian concern, not moral obligation, not the fulfillment of a sacred promise. Extremely useful propaganda. For a bankrupt empire drowning in debt, desperate for survival. That is what the Balfour Declaration was designed to be. On the 2nd of November 1907, Arthur Balfour signed the letter. 67 words, and every single one of them had been chosen with surgical precision. The phrase national home rather than state was chosen deliberately because it was ambiguous. Did it promise a Jewish state? Not explicitly. Did it promise Jewish immigration and settlement? Yes. Did it protect the political rights of the 700,000 Arabs already living there? No. It protected their civil and religious rights, the right to pray, the right to go to church or mosque, but not the right to vote on their own future. Not the right to determine what happened to the land their families had worked for generations. That right was not mentioned, and the man the letter was addressed to was not the Zionist negotiating lead. Weizmann had wanted the letter addressed to him directly. Balfour chose Rothschild instead. Why? Because the Rothschild name carried something that Weizmann's name could not yet match. It carried financial weight. It sent a signal to every Jewish investor in New York, to every Jewish community watching from Petrograd to Chicago, that Britain was not simply making a political statement. It was making a financial commitment backed by the most recognizable banking name in the world. The same banking family that was financially connected to J.P. Morgan, Britain's primary creditor, the institution keeping Britain alive. The letter went to Rothschild because Rothschild meant money, and money was what Britain needed most. The declaration was published on the 9th of November 1917. Within days, the Bolshevik Revolution had already happened. Lenin had entered Petrograd. The new Soviet government had immediately called for an armistice. Russia was leaving the war. The declaration's primary strategic objective, keeping Russia in the war by appealing to Jewish opinion there, had been rendered completely irrelevant within 72 hours of the letter being made public. The propaganda asset Britain had traded for had expired before it could be used. The bankrupt empire had made its calculation. It had traded a promise it did not own for a propaganda advantage it never received. It had issued 3 obligations against the same land, knowing they could not all be honored. It had addressed the letter to a banker because bankers were who it needed to impress, and it had buried the rights of 700,000 people in a subordinate clause at the end of 67 words that it hoped nobody would examine too carefully. But here's what history demands we acknowledge honestly. The men who made this decision were not cartoonish villains. Balfour and Lloyd George had genuine personal sympathy for the Jewish cause rooted in their religious upbringings and a real belief the Jewish people deserved a homeland after centuries of persecution. Weizmann was not a manipulator. He was a genuine nationalist who had dedicated his life to a dream and who used every tool available to him to achieve it. And the Jewish communities who would eventually settle in that land were human beings fleeing real persecution, building schools and hospitals and universities, trying to construct a home after being driven from every other home they had tried to make in Europe. Good faith mixed with imperial calculation, mixed with genuine desperation, produced the 67 words. But good faith pursued through the vehicle of imperial power, with no accountability to the people most affected, produces outcomes indistinguishable from deliberate harm. The existing majority population did not participate in the transaction that determined their fate. They were not at the table. They were not consulted. They appeared in the letter only as an unnamed mass whose civil and religious rights were mentioned not to offer genuine protection, but to provide plausible deniability. A bankrupt empire trading promises for survival addressed to a banker about land it did not own over the heads of the people living there. That is what the Balfour Declaration was. Not a moral statement, not a humanitarian gesture. A transaction. Conducted with the cold logic of a state that understood leverage and obligation and strategic interest and nothing else. John Maynard Keynes, one of the greatest economic minds Britain ever produced, was a young Treasury official during the First World War. He watched the financial contortions of his government with clear eyes, and he later wrote that the statesmen of 1917 were juggling with fires that they barely understood. The Balfour Declaration may be the most consequential fire any of them lit, and it has never stopped burning. If you made it to the end of this, you already understand something that most people watching the news today do not. The conflict you see reported every week did not begin with a battle. It began with a letter, 67 words, written by a bankrupt empire, addressed to a banker. That is not conspiracy theory. That is documented history, and that is a lesson we cannot afford to stop asking questions about. If this connected dots that most financial history leaves deliberately separate, subscribe. The next episode follows the same money, the same banking networks into the next chapter of this story.